For nearly 90 years, the concrete and stone Peace Cross has stood at a busy crossroads in Bladensburg, Maryland. On a plaque at its base are inscribed the names of the 49 men from Prince George's County who lost their lives in service to their country in what was then known as the Great War, World War I. The fact that most of the memorial is a 40-foot cross offends a DC-based group called the American Humanist Association. The group and 3 individual plaintiffs say a Christian cross does not belong on government property.
Well, I know if I lived in that town and my 2 daughters saw that and said, why is it that government supports Christianity? We're not Christians, right? You know, there's something inherently wrong with that. It sends the signal that not all of us are equal Americans.
The lawsuit asks that the Park Commission, which owns the land and the cross, be prohibited from displaying the structure on public property. The Park Commission maintains the cross is not a religious symbol.
The Peace Cross was originally and always intended to be a secular memorial to the veterans of World War I. It does have plaques and inscriptions on it that serve that purpose, but there is no religious language on the cross whatsoever.
Local merchants say the Peace Cross is a handy landmark that for generations has helped customers find their stores.
I don't really see what's wrong with it being there. I think the people are just, I guess, just trying to find a problem with something. They don't got nothing else better to do.
Under the rules of the federal court, the Park and Planning Commission has 60 days in which to respond to the lawsuit filed by the humanists. So we should know soon whether the Park and Planning Commission is willing to spend the money for a court fight to maintain the Peace Cross as it has existed since 1925. In Bladensburg, Maryland, John Henrahan, Fox 5 Local News.
The wicked shall be turned into hell, and all the nations that forget God. For the needy shall not always be forgotten. The expectation of the poor shall not perish forever. Arise, O Lord, let not man prevail. Let the heathen be judged in thy sight. Put them in fear, O Lord, that the nations may know themselves to be but men. Selah.
All kinds of developments in the Ukraine crisis. That country's new prime minister insisting Crimea must remain part of Ukraine as top diplomats from around the world meet in Paris. They had planned to discuss Syria's civil war. Now they're trying to defuse the growing tensions over Russia's military takeover of Crimea. NATO taking up the issue directly with Russia at a meeting in Brussels. Meantime, Russia test fires a ballistic missile as an international team of military observers heads to Crimea. Joining us now with some thoughts, retired Lieutenant Colonel Bill Cowan, Fox News military analyst. Bill, what a situation. This ICBM that the Russians launched, how big a deal is that?
Well, John, what's interesting about that is that, of course, they did notify us ahead of time that they were going to do it. But the reality is Putin could have, given the tension in Crimea, said, look, we'll hold off on that test firing considering all the things that are going on. Instead, he went ahead and had that missile fired, John. And, you know, that missile is a reminder, should be a reminder to all of us that the Russians still have a very capable nuclear power force. They have over 1,500 of those missiles. Those missiles can go 6,500 miles. That is further than from Moscow to Los Angeles. And it's just a reminder that the Russians are not playing around. So having said that, is that missile a threat to the Crimea? No, but is it a threat to the rest of the world? If Putin decides to use it, it is.
Yeah, it makes one wonder about the wisdom of scrapping that anti-missile shield that we had agreed with Poland and the Czech Republic to place on their soil. It was canceled early in the Obama administration, right?
It was, John, and that was unfortunate. We really betrayed our allies in Poland and Czechoslovakia, who had worked so hard with their own populations to get their populations to agree to let us put those two in there, the systems in there in both of those countries. And we put them in there under the notion that it was to protect us against the Iranians if they ever developed an ICBM capability. Of course they have. Joe Biden poo-pooed it at the time. But also, it wasn't spoken, but it was known that that was also to protect us against the Russians in case they decided to use ICBMs. So, you know, we may come to rue the day that we didn't put those missile defense shields in as asked. And that was one of the first acts Obama did, was to scrap that potential system.
And the thinking at the time was that it was an act of good faith to sort of defuse some of the long simmering tensions between Russia and the United States. And I guess what? This is the thanks we get?
Exactly, John. That was part of the reset button. And, you know, this administration operating in fantasy land, as many of your guests over the last few days have said, a fantasy land about who Putin is and what Russia's real objectives are in the world. And it's not all as peachy keen as it appears to be from the White House.
So what would you do? I mean, Russia is making some ludicrous claims, for instance, saying that they don't even control the troops that have invaded the Crimean because they are local defense forces, for instance. What would you do to try to bring an end to this thing, or at least to try to make the Russians back down?
John, I don't think we're going to do anything, us or the Ukraine or the European Union, NATO, whoever. Nobody's going to get Putin to pull out of there. It's simply not going to happen. But
so many people across the United States and beyond asking, how come nobody knew this was about to happen? If President Putin had this plan to go in and essentially take over Crimea, how'd we miss it? Catherine Herridge works intelligence for us and is live from Washington this afternoon. Catherine, is there an answer yet?
Well, Chef, Fox News confirming new details of these conflicting intelligence assessments. Analysts at the Pentagon concluding Friday that there would be no Russian movements for 24 hours, while analysts at the CIA left the door open, and by Saturday, Russia had taken over the Ukrainian peninsula of Crimea. Today, the head of the House Intelligence Committee, who is launching the review, defended the analysts who wrongly concluded that the Russian troop buildup was a bluff.
I don't believe it was an intelligence failure. I think we had all the collection points were good. There was indicators that there may be some troop movement. One agency got that right, and another agency didn't get it right. So what we're going to do is have a review, look at if there were any on-the-ground collection intelligence gaps.
One source telling Fox News that they are evaluating what the intelligence community assesses about Putin's personality and decision-making, and whether there's a fundamental gap or lack of understanding that led to the faulty assessments. By example, in 2008, Putin faced a similar scenario with limited options, but he demonstrated a willingness and ultimate capability to go into Georgia, which also blindsided the U.S. A spokesman for the nation's intelligence chief, who oversees the agencies, saying the intelligence community has provided timely and valuable information that has helped policymakers understand the situation on the ground and make informed decisions. That continues to be the case today. Any suggestion that there were intelligence shortcomings related to the situation in Ukraine is uninformed and misleading. The CIA also defended its analysts, saying they left the door open for that military option, Shepard.
Catherine Herridge reporting from Washington this afternoon. Very interesting that they say there were no gaps, and yet this happened without anybody knowing about it. Maybe at some point we'll find out how those two things come together.
What should the United States do or not do about this growing conflict, and could we have avoided this? Former Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld joins us. Good evening, sir.
Good evening.
What should we do or not do? What should President Obama do or not do?
Well, the focus, not surprisingly, is on that question. And it's understandable, but it's way too narrow. You know, yesterday it was Syria, today it's Ukraine, tomorrow it could be the Republic of Georgia again. It could be Central Asia, Iran, North Korea. At this stage, near-term options are few. It seems to me the central problem is bigger and critically important. America, and that is America's weakness. Specifically, the U.S. is behaving in a way that tells the world we're in decline, that we're in withdrawal. We've created a leadership vacuum in the world, and it is being filled by the Putins of the world. By people without our values or our interests. And it's to the detriment of the United States and our friends and allies around the world. But it is the United States that's injected that instability into the world equation.
You know, it's sort of interesting to say that the Washington Post editorial board online had an editorial yesterday about President Obama, and they described his foreign policy. They used the word fantasy, and that seems to be a departure from at least what this editorial board thought of the president until this point.
Well, that could even be the understatement of the year. It seems to me that the immediate task to respond to your question, Greta, the task is to recognize that the mission must determine the coalition, and the coalition cannot determine the mission. And the mumblings and chatterings about the UN and the international community really is a misunderstanding, because what you have to do is decide. We know that the international community is only words. What needs to be done is to fashion a coalition based on a specific mission. And the mission has to be to put maximum pressure on the Russian Federation and Putin, pressure of all types. And it has to be only the countries who agree with that. And you're not going to get the UN to agree to that, obviously. So the thing we've got to persuade other countries of is that we get peace through strength, as Eisenhower said. If we want peace, we have to be prepared for war, and that it is U.S. weakness that has shaken the world. In Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Johnson years, we were spending 10% of GDP on defense. Today, we're spending less than 4%. Our European allies are spending less than 2%. The administration lacks a foreign policy. They lack a strategy. They're managing our economy, modeling it on Europe, which is a failed model, and it's sending the signal out across the globe that the United States is not going to be there for them, that the United States is in decline. And we're doing the same thing with all the talk of cutting our defense budget.
You met President Putin in 2001. What was your impression of him?
Uncomfortable, clearly a KGB type, tough, intelligent, and with fundamentally different interests than the United States. But I also saw Russia as basically a country that has a relatively modest economy, with the exception of its energy capabilities and leverage. It's got a military that's big and has a lot of nuclear weapons, but it's a conscript military, and that he is today punching way above his weight class, and the United States is punching way below ours.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for calling. Thank you for talking to us.
You bet.
How much she hath glorified herself and lived deliciously, so much torment and sorrow give her. For she saith in her heart, I sit a queen, and am no widow, and shall see no sorrow. Therefore shall her plagues come in one day, death and mourning and famine, and she shall be utterly burned with fire. For strong is the Lord God who judgeth her.